They found her in silence. A chamber sealed for centuries, deep beneath the crumbling stones of an ancient palace. When the archaeologists broke through the final layer of dust and plaster, the torchlight fell upon a figure seated upright, her face preserved beneath a thin veil of linen, her hands still folded over a bouquet that had turned to ash. At first they thought she was a statue, but she wasn't. She was a bride. A bride who had never left her wedding. Her skin, fragile as parchment, clung to the bones beneath. Her wedding gown, once white silk, now the color of dust, shimmered faintly as if refusing to decay. And on her lips, beneath the layers of resin and time, there was something terrible. The trace of a final breath. This was no ceremonial burial. This was punishment. Who was she? What crime had condemned a princess to die encased in her own bridal dress, entombed not by nature, but by human hands? Tonight, we uncover the story that history tried to bury alive. The tale of a royal bride whose beauty became her curse, whose silence became legend, and whose final heartbeat still echoes through the stone corridors of a forgotten kingdom. You believe lost stories like hers deserve to be remembered. Stories of betrayal, cruelty, and unthinkable sorrow. Subscribe, so we can bring the forgotten back to life. Because some ghosts don't haunt castles, they haunt history itself. Long before her name was erased from every chronicle, she was the jewel of a desert empire, her kingdom, now a wasteland of wind and ruin, once shimmered between the golden dunes like a mirage. The walls of its capital gleamed white under the relentless sun, carved from limestone so pure it reflected light like glass. Palm groves whispered in the wind beyond the city gates, and fountains sang in the courtyards of the palace. Fountains that never ran dry, for beneath the sand, rivers of ancient wealth flowed unseen. It was a world built on silence. Silence of the slaves who carried marble from distant quarries. Silence of the concubines who smiled behind their veils. Silence of the guards who bowed before the royal family and spoke only when commanded. Even the wind seemed careful not to disturb the palace walls, where the air was heavy with secrets. The princess was born beneath an eclipse, a dark sun over a white city. The priests said it was a sign that she would belong not to the world, of the living, but to the realm of shadows. Her mother died in childbirth, and her father, the Sultan, looked upon his newborn daughter with both awe and fear. She had her mother's eyes, bright, sharp, and unyielding. In a palace where women were ornaments, that was a dangerous inheritance. She grew up in the shadow of her father's throne, a girl of quiet defiance. While her tutors recited verses about obedience and grace, she listened instead to the whispers of the servants, the gossip of soldiers, the songs sung in the market where she was forbidden to walk. She learned early that truth and beauty were both dangerous, but one could be used to protect the other. The Sultan loved her, in his own way. But his love was possessive, guarded, brittle. He often said, "A daughter's honor is a mirror of her father's soul." He kept her hidden from all but the most trusted courtiers. Painters who were summoned to capture her likeness were blinded after their work was done, so no eye but his could look upon her face. She lived in gold, but not in freedom. Her chambers overlooked the Western Garden, a place she could never step into. Each evening, she would press her hand against the lattice window and watch the servants tending to the jasmine vines, the doves circling above the reflecting pools. Sometimes beyond the garden walls, she would catch the faint sound of a song, a man's voice, low and rough, singing in a language she did not know. That voice haunted her. It came from the stables, from the soldiers' quarters, from the world she would never be allowed to touch. She imagined its owner, a guard perhaps, or a servant, someone unworthy of even speaking her name. Yet when she heard his voice, something inside her rebelled against the quiet perfection of her life. In the palace, she was taught that fate was fixed, that a princess was a symbol, not a soul. But when the sun dipped low and the sky bled, crimson over the dunes, she dared to believe that destiny could be rewritten, that even within these marble walls, she might find a moment of truth untouched by power. Her father's court was not kind. The viziers whispered about omens. The priests warned that her beauty would bring ruin, that the eclipse had marked her for sorrow, but their warnings only seemed to fuel the Sultan's pride. "Let them fear her," he said, "for if beauty can destroy, then let her destroy in my name." So he raised her to be untouchable, not a daughter, but an emblem of his dynasty's strength. Poets called her the bride of the sun, the woman destined to bind kingdoms together with her smile. And though she smiled when ordered, her eyes never softened. Beneath the gold and perfume, she carried a quiet dread, the knowledge that her life was no longer her own. By the time she turned 17, suitors came from every corner of the world, princes from the north, merchants from the east, men who arrived with armies or treasures or prayers. None saw her. All desired her. Her father received them with cold amusement, turning their gifts into power. But the princess? She watched from behind the veil, her heart a silent revolt. And one night, as the desert wind howled beyond the palace, she heard the song again, that same haunting voice. This time, closer. Beneath her window. When she looked down, she saw him for the first time. A stable hand, his tunic torn, his hair tangled by the dust, standing in the moonlight with a face both fierce and fragile. Their eyes met, only for a moment. But in that instant, the silence that had ruled her life cracked like glass. For in a kingdom built on silence, even a whisper could be fatal, and hers had just begun. Love, in her world, was not a choice. It was a sentence. By the time she reached her 18th year, the palace had become her cage in full. The marble walls that once seemed divine now pressed against her like a tomb. Servants avoided her. Gaze, afraid of the curse the priests whispered, followed her. Yet the songs she heard at night, the voice that lingered beyond her window, became the only truth she trusted. The man's name was Rafiq, a stable hand of no family, no title, and no right to even look at her. He was born of the desert, wind, rough, sun-darkened, with eyes that carried the defiance of the wild. He tended the royal horses with a reverence that bordered on love, whispering to them as if they understood his language. And perhaps they did, for the Sultan's steeds obeyed no one as they obeyed him. For months they never spoke, only exchanged glances across forbidden spaces. But silence is a fragile barrier. One night, she dropped a single white flower from her balcony, a jasmine bloom from her own garden. He caught it in his hand, pressed it to his chest, and for the first time in her life, the princess felt seen, not as a symbol, but as a soul. Their secret grew in the shadows. Under the watch of the moon, they met in the old courtyard where guards patrolled. She came veiled, trembling, the scent of myrrh clinging to her hair. He bowed low, not from duty but awe. And when he spoke her name, her true name, whispered as if it might burn his tongue, the world itself seemed to pause. They spoke of small things at first, the horses, the stars, the taste of rain when it fell on sand. But soon their words became something else, confessions. He told her of the endless horizon beyond the palace, of the caravans that moved like constellations across the desert. She told him of her loneliness, of the weight of a crown she did not yet wear. "You are free," she said once. "You can run when the gates open." He smiled, eyes dark as the dunes at dusk. "And leave the one thing worth staying for?" From that night, she was no longer alone. But love, in a palace ruled by fear is the most dangerous secret of all. It did not take long for the walls to whisper. The handmaidens noticed her flushed cheeks, the servants her late walks. The guards found footprints that should not have been there. And when the vizier's spies reported what they saw, a princess and a stable hand beneath the moon, the court erupted in quiet horror. The sultan's pride was his god, and when pride is wounded, mercy dies. One evening, he summoned his daughter to the Hall of Amber. The torches flickered low, casting red light across the marble like veins of fire. The air was thick with incense and danger. He did not rise when she entered. He did not speak for a long while. At last he said, "You have shamed me." She tried to answer, but her throat was dry, her heart pounding like a drum. "I have given you the world," he continued, his voice soft, deadly. "And you give your heart to a servant." Her hands trembled. "He loves me." The words hung in the air like an arrow mid-flight. The Sultan's eyes, cold, ancient, unblinking, narrowed. "Then he will die for it." She fell to her knees, her veil slipping, tears striking the polished stone like rain on marble. "Please," she whispered, "if there is any mercy in you." But mercy is the first casualty of power. The next morning, Rafiq was dragged from the stables. The soldiers said nothing as they beat him, their faces blank beneath their helmets. The princess was forced to watch from her balcony as he was tied to a post in the courtyard below. She screamed his name, once, twice, but the sound was swallowed by the drums. The Sultan gave a signal. The executioner's blade fell. When it was done, they burned his body and scattered the ashes in the desert wind, the same wind that had once carried his songs to her window. The Sultan forbade his name ever to be spoken again. That night the palace was silent, but the silence was heavier than ever before. The princess did not weep where anyone could see her. She sat before her mirror, her bridal jewels already prepared, for the Sultan, in his fury, had arranged her marriage to another, a foreign king, a warlord twice her age, known for his cruelty and wealth. The Sun King, they called him, a ruler whose palaces shone with gold and whose wives vanished without graves. Her wedding would unite two empires. It would erase her sin. It would prove her obedience. But she no longer believed in obedience. The moonlight bled across her reflection. She looked into her own eyes and saw something her father could never kill: defiance. A seed of rebellion growing in the soil of her grief. And on the night before her wedding, she swore an oath. If she could not live in freedom, she would die in truth. And history would remember her, not as a bride, but as the ghost her father created. The morning of her wedding rose like any other in the desert. The sun merciless, the air heavy with dust and perfume. But inside the palace, something was wrong. The halls felt hollow, the air stifled. Even the fountains in the courtyard seemed to murmur in mourning. From the highest balcony, banners of gold and crimson rippled in the heat, while below, servants hurried to prepare the procession. They dressed her in silks, spun from the finest threads, layered her in jewels cold against her skin. Her hair was braided with pearls. The scent of incense clung to every step she took. To the world, she was a vision of divine grace, the perfect bride for the Sun King. But behind her veil, her face was pale, her lips colorless. She did not tremble. She did not speak. It was said later that her eyes looked empty, like the calm of the desert before a storm. Her father watched from his throne, pride gleaming in his gaze, blind to the darkness behind her stillness. To him, she was restored, purified by punishment, redeemed by obedience. Her shame had been erased, replaced by the radiance of sacrifice. But those who looked closer, the maidservants, the old nurse who had raised her, saw it. The silence, was too complete. The calm too absolute. They whispered that she had not forgiven, that she had not forgotten, and they were right. As the musicians began to play, the drums echoed through the city, deep, rhythmic, relentless. Bells tolled from every tower, their sound carried on the wind like a summons to fate. The people gathered in the square to watch the procession, unaware that they were about to witness something far more terrible than a royal marriage. The princess was led through the corridor of mirrors, the hall where every bride of the dynasty had walked before her. She saw her reflection repeated 1,000 times, each one colder, paler, deader than the last. For a moment, she thought she saw Rafik behind her, his face reflected in the glass, his eyes filled with sorrow. But when she turned, there was only the priest waiting at the end of the hall, his hand outstretched. She walked past him, straight past him. The guards moved to block her path, but her voice, steady, commanding, froze them in place. "Tell my father," she said, "that his bride will not kneel before another tyrant." In that moment, something inside the palace shifted. A single act of defiance echoing through centuries of obedience. The priest tried to speak, to command her to stop, but she raised her hand. "Enough," she said, and the music faltered. The bells stuttered. The hall fell silent. She turned and faced her father, her veil trembling in the heat. "You killed the man I loved," she said. "You took my voice, my freedom, my soul, but you will not take my will." The Sultan rose from his throne, fury twisting his face. "You will marry," he thundered, "or you will die unworthy of your blood." She looked at him with a calm he did not understand. "Then let me die as myself." Gasps rippled through the court. The guard stepped forward, but before they could reach her, she lifted a small vial from beneath her veil, a vial of resin and herbs stolen from the embalmer's chambers. The Sultan's voice cracked through the air. "Stop her!" But it was too late. She drank. For a heartbeat, the world held still. Then her body shuddered. The cup fell from her hand, shattering against the marble like the breaking of a curse. She collapsed at the foot of her father's throne, her white dress spreading around her like a pool of snow, her eyes open, fixed on the ceiling's golden dome. No one moved. No one dared. When the physicians rushed forward, they found her still breathing, shallow, trembling, but alive. The poison had not killed her. It had only paralyzed her limbs, slowed her pulse to a whisper. The Sultan, terrified of scandal and divine punishment, ordered that her death be declared. The priests wrapped her in her bridal dress and prepared her for burial. But he forbade her to be interred among the queens. "She has brought shame," he said. "Let her be sealed beneath the palace, where even her ghost will not escape." And so they carried her, pale, motionless, beautiful, into the catacombs. They laid her on a bed of linen and began to anoint her body with resin and myrrh. They poured oil over her lips, sealed her eyes with coins, and wrapped her in gauze layer by layer until her face was lost. But what none of them saw, what only she knew, was that she was still awake. Her mind screamed as they placed the final layer across her mouth. Her chest rose, barely perceptible. The incense burned her lungs. The darkness pressed down like stone. When they sealed the tomb, her last breath echoed in the silence, a sound no one heard, and yet one that would never stop. They called it a burial, but it was an execution. Centuries later, the sand gave her back. It was a storm that unearthed the edge of her tomb, a violent wind that tore through the desert, flinging grains like needles against the ruined palace walls. When the storm passed, a hollow sound echoed. Beneath the dunes, the breath of an air pocket sealed for generations. The locals who discovered it spoke of a smell, not of rot, but of incense. Sweet, ancient, and wrong. The archaeologists arrived weeks later, skeptical but curious. They came with shovels, brushes, and the arrogance of modern certainty. The desert, they believed, held no ghosts, only relics. Yet as they dug deeper, as the passage revealed itself, their bravado began to crumble. The first chamber they entered was filled with broken jars and the remains of what had once been offerings. Dried pomegranates, gold coins, fragments of bridal jewelry blackened by time. Strange, they noted, for a burial site. No royal sigils, no inscriptions of triumph. Just silence. Then they found the door. It was made not of stone, but of resin, thick, translucent, and fused like amber. Embedded within it were petals, white jasmine, preserved as if plucked yesterday. The lead archaeologist, Dr. Samir al-Nasser, later wrote in his journal, "The moment we broke through, I felt the air change, as if something had been waiting. What they found inside would haunt them all." The chamber was small, barely large, enough for one person to stand. Its walls were covered in gold leaf, but the designs were faded, eaten away by centuries of heat and silence. In the center sat the figure, upright, veiled, surrounded by dried flowers that had once been white. The body had not decayed. She was sitting in her bridal dress. The fabric, though fragile, still shimmered faintly under the torchlight. Her veil was intact, draped perfectly over her face. One hand rested on her lap, the other slightly raised, as if she had tried, in her last moment, to reach upward. It took the scientists hours to realize what the priests centuries before had never admitted. This was no ordinary mummification. The linen had been layered in haste, unevenly. The resin had been poured too thick around her chest, hardening like armor, and beneath the resin, small fractures ran across the inner surface, cracks shaped not by time, but by movement. Scratch marks. Dr. al-Nasser described them in trembling handwriting. She tried to move. She tried to breathe. God help her, she tried to escape. The discovery stunned the world. Newspapers called her the Mummified Bride, the Desert Princess, the Bride of the Living Tomb. Photographs of her veiled figure spread across continents, a haunting testament to cruelty and devotion intertwined. But among the scholars, debates raged. Some insisted she had been buried alive, punished for sin. Others claimed it was a ritual mistake, a misjudged dose of embalming resin that sealed her before her heart had stopped. A few, the most superstitious, whispered of curses, that her spirit had demanded the sands conceal her suffering until the world was ready to see it. In Cairo, a conference was held to discuss her case. The experts spoke in measured tones about preservation, royal custom, post-mortem rigidity, but none could explain the final, chilling detail that emerged when her sarcophagus was analyzed under ultraviolet light. Across the inner lid, faintly, etched into the gold, were words written in a hand too elegant to be the embalmer's. "Let him hear me." No one knew what it meant, but the locals did. In the nearby villages, they had always spoken of her, the princess who would not die, the one whose voice still echoed in the wind. On nights when the moon hung low over the dunes, shepherds claimed to hear her, a woman weeping softly, her cries mingling with the hiss of sand against stone. Dr. al-Nasser dismissed the legends. At least he did until the night before the tomb was sealed again. Alone in the chamber, cataloging the final artifacts, he thought he heard something, a faint rustling like linen against skin. Then a sound that froze his blood. A breath. He turned, his flashlight trembling. The air was still. The figure sat unmoving, eternal. Yet he swore, in that moment, that the veil fluttered, though no wind touched it. He he left the desert the next morning and never returned. The tomb was resealed, this time with steel and cement. The artifacts were locked in the National Museum, where her bridal dress remains under glass. So delicate it seems to sigh when the air conditioning hums too close. Visitors still come. They stand before her and whisper prayers. Some claim to smell jasmine, others myrrh, and a few say that if you stand long enough, you can see her fingers shift, ever so slightly, as if still clawing at the air that once betrayed her. Night falls quickly in the desert. One moment, the dunes are drenched in gold. The next, they are swallowed by an ocean of black. And when darkness comes, the wind begins to speak. It moves across the sand like memory, soft, endless, and cruel. In that wind, they say you can hear her. The locals call her Al-Arusa al-Mansaya, the forgotten bride. For generations, shepherds, traders, and travelers have sworn that on certain nights, when the moon bleeds red and the air smells faintly of myrrh, a figure appears among the dunes. A woman dressed in white, her veil flowing like smoke, walking barefoot through the sand. Her face is never seen. Her steps leave no trace. But those who hear her sobbing say it carries all the sorrow of 1,000 years. She walks toward the ruins of the old palace, where only fragments remain. The crumbled columns, the half-buried mosaics, the stairway that once led to her father's throne. There, she kneels among the stones, as if searching for something that was taken from her. Some say she calls a name, Rafiq, over and over, her voice breaking like wind through dry reeds. Others say she is silent, her lips moving, but her voice lost to the centuries. And though the villagers fear her, they also bring her offerings. Bouquets of jasmine, bowls of milk and honey, strands of white silk tied to the ruins. Not as worship, but as apology. For in their hearts, they know that the curse of her story is not her suffering, but their silence. The silence of those who watched her die and said nothing. When historians speak of her now, they do so carefully, as if afraid that naming her might wake her again. The museums call her the veiled mummy of Al-Qamar, after the moon that hung over her wedding night. Scholars still argue about the details, the resin, the markings, the strange preservation of her skin. But every theory, chemical, physiological, forensic, breaks down under one simple fact. No body that died naturally should have looked the way she did. Her lips were parted. Her eyes, beneath the sealed resin, had not been closed properly. The muscles of her neck were tensed, not relaxed. And her hands were positioned not in peace, but in protest. She died reaching for air. Perhaps that is why she still walks. Over time, her legend grew beyond history. Artists painted her as the eternal bride, caught between love and vengeance, purity and rebellion. Poets wrote of her as a symbol of forbidden love, of women whose voices were buried under the weight of obedience. Even modern playwrights adapted her story, some calling her saint, others calling her ghost. But all agreed on one thing: she did not die quietly. In the desert, the past is not buried. It waits. And the princess's story became the kind of truth that cannot be confined to tombs or textbooks. She became myth, and myths, unlike people, never stop breathing. A century after her discovery, the museum that held her bridal dress caught fire during a sandstorm. The blaze destroyed nearly everything in the collection. Yet when the smoke cleared, the case containing her veil was untouched. The silk was unburned. The glass uncracked. The guards who survived swore the fire had stopped at the edge of her display, as if the flames themselves had bowed before her. That night, a power outage left the city in darkness, and over the hum of the wind, people claimed they heard bells, faint, distant, tolling from somewhere beneath the sand. The wedding bells that had once rung for her. The bells that had fallen silent when she did. Perhaps the desert remembered her. Perhaps it pitied her. Or perhaps it feared her too. Because the story of the forgotten bride is not only her tragedy, it is a mirror. A reflection of every woman buried alive by obedience. Every voice sealed in silence. Every love condemned because it did not serve power. Her tomb may be sealed again, her body forever still. But the truth she carried, that a heart cannot be commanded, lingers like a curse on the wind, and so, when travelers cross the dunes and feel the air grow suddenly cold, they do not look back. They whisper a prayer, drop a flower into the sand, and keep walking. For they know the truth of the legend. She is not waiting for rescue. She is waiting for remembrance. And when the moon rises full and pale over the desert, when the world is quiet enough to listen, her veil lifts once more in the breeze. Somewhere, a voice sighs, half sorrow, half fury, carried through time. You buried me in silence, but silence remembers. The wind answers with nothing. The stars look down, unblinking. And the forgotten princess, eternal in her bridal dress, walks on through the night. Not dead, not alive, but unforgotten.